Hi everyone, I'm Joanna Penn from thecreativepenn.com, and today I'm here on Clapham Common in London with David Baboulene, who's the author of The Storybook, and today we're going to talk about all things story related, so welcome David.
Thank you, thank you.
Okay, so I'm writing story and I read a lot of stories, but in the way that you're talking about it, I don't think I understand necessarily what the structure is of a story. Maybe you could just explain that.
Yes. There are three key elements to the top level of a story, let's say, the framework elements I call them. Number one, the most important one of all, or the biggest selling one of all, the most popular type of story, always carries within it an arc of character growth. A character will, across the course of a story, change and learn and grow, develop in some tangible, meaningful life way. They will advance from a lowly position to a slightly higher one, or at least they'll be given the opportunity to learn those lessons. Whether they succeed or not, those lessons are still evident to the reader or to the viewer. So I think that's probably the most important thing someone can look for in a story idea, is if a character changes and learns and grows. Every great story has that facet. Doesn't have to have, there's no rule base here. A lot of the second tier, a lot of stories only obey the second tier, which is that you have a key question. So you'll have heard this in most structural formula, if you like. A story has a key question that's raised in the mind of the reader, and there's usually an inciting incident that raises that key question. The key question is then answered, or at least addressed satisfactorily, by the conclusion of the story. So it's addressed at climax. So if you take a story like, I don't know, Back to the Future is my favourite one. Those two elements are both there in all their glory. So the character development, Marty McFly starts off in fairly lowly, humble surroundings. His parents, his mum's an alcoholic, she's got the vodka out at breakfast. His father is bullied by his boss at work. They live in a fairly, humble surroundings. By the end of the story, all of those values have gone up. The father is proud and assertive and strong, and the mother is, they're off to the golf club, and the house is all wonderful, and they have all these aspirational things. He's changed and learnt and grown across the course of the story. And the key question is raised when at the beginning of the story the inciting incident is that he gets sent back in time accidentally, and the key question is raised in your mind: how will he get home again? Will he get home again? And those key questions are addressed in climax and resolution. So those are the two key elements, the framework elements, and the third major component of a story that defines it as a story as opposed to some other means of information transfer is subtext. Every story has to have subtext, and the more subtext there is, the more story there is, and if you have no subtext, you have no story. Yep. So that's quite a big topic to address, but subtext is the critical thing.
So you mentioned subtext, and I know that's what you're doing a PhD on as well. So maybe you could explain, what the hell is subtext anyway, and why do I need it?
Right. Well, subtext, if you look it up in the dictionary, subtext is the underlying story, the story that you perceive that's not written, that's not obvious at the textual level. So if two characters, let's say you and I are in a restaurant, and I say, Joanne, I love you so much, you're just the most beautiful woman I've ever seen. Right? And yet the audience knows that our marriage is falling apart, and that I have another woman in the car park waiting with the engine running, and I'm just trying to get a signature out of you for some reason, That is the underlying story. I'm saying I love you, but that's not necessarily true. It is, of course it's true, but it's not true in story terms, and the audience have perceived something else, and they want to know what's happening in the underlying story. That's the important one, not the textual one on the surface. You see? So, in essence, subtext is any form of knowledge gap. So as far as writers are concerned, it's all about introducing gaps in knowledge between two characters, or between a character and the audience, or between the author and the audience, between fate, Mother Nature, anything you like. As long as there's a gap in knowledge, then there will be intrigue and engagement. So a writer doesn't work with subtext. A reader receives a story in subtext. A writer works with knowledge gaps. Any form of lies, deceit, metaphor, of course, when you come out of a story with some sort of moral learning from it, then that was never mentioned in the story. The Hare and the Tortoise, tiny story, the Ugly Duckling, you come out of it with some moral understanding of the world outside. That's a knowledge gap that's been filled. You didn't have that knowledge before, and you have afterwards. None of it was stated. Subtext through metaphor. And then dialogue, of course. When someone says something, they very rarely mean what they say, even in real life. people don't tell the truth, they don't even know the truth themselves. So dialogue's a very powerful way of introducing subtext. In that earlier example where I'm saying to my wife how much I love her when the audience knows I'm about to... That is subtext through dialogue. I'm saying I love you, the audience know I don't. You see? Okay. Dialogue, actions, promise, implication, suggestion, lies, deceit, metaphor, all of these things are tools of the writer to bed in knowledge gaps, and they're all types of delivery in subtext.
As a writer, so I've got my first draft.
Right.
How am I going to improve my story using these techniques?
You need to be questioning your story at those framework element levels. Do I have character growth across the course of the entire story? You might find, for example, in Back to the Future, they've got a wonderful story about a kid who goes back in time and meets his dad, and they might decide that there's no character growth there. Marty McFly ends up the same character at the end as he started at the beginning, but his dad changed and grew over the course of the story. His dad is the one that progressed from a weak, unassertive, scared teenager to a strong, assertive, capable man. There's the character growth that defines the story. So you need to look for those things. That's what I'd be doing if I was turning your book into a movie. I'd be saying, where is the power in this story? And the first thing I look for is character growth. You don't even need the other things. If you've got great character growth, there's your story. And the finest stories are just purely about character growth. The second thing, particularly in a first draft, a very common dynamic, if you like, is that the story starts much later than the writer thinks it does. So in a 200-page story, let's say, generally speaking, the beginning is some 50 pages in, and they don't even realise it. They end up throwing away the first 3 to 5 chapters, 50 to 100 pages, because there's your beginning, there's your entry point, and that's all about that inciting incident we talked about. If your story has one, there's no need for it to, but if it has one, finding that inciting incident and saying, right, that is where the story really kicks off. When I've raised that key question in the mind of my audience, that is where my story kicks off. And therefore, my ending has to address that key question. If I'm going to raise one there, I'm going to hold it open for the whole of the sort of Act 2, if you like, the bulk of my story. I need to address that key question at the end. I don't have to answer it, but I need to address it satisfactorily, having raised the key question. Will Marty McFly get back to 1985? By the end of the story, if you've gone off somewhere else and answered some other questions, people will be dissatisfied because they'll go home without having had that addressed. So that's the second key thing that people look for in a story if you're going to structure it up for some commercial purpose.
Alright, so we talked about this character development stuff and how important the character arc is, but you also have Lee Child in your book, who I love, and he says that character development doesn't matter. Jack Reacher never changes.
Yes.
He needs him to stay the same every book. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, isn't it? When you're writing, particularly, funny enough, when I was talking to John Sullivan about Only Fools and Horses, he had the same problem, whereby if you allow your characters to change and grow, then they hit the ceiling when they suddenly become fulfilled, and you've got nowhere to go with the next book. So yeah, there's a strong need, if you want to have sequels, not to let your characters grow too much. So the answer to that, John Sullivan's answer, was to allow life to change and grow, to let their characters change and grow. So Del Boy doesn't have to change if he has a baby. He can still be Del Boy, but there's a life change there, there's a growth in ways that we would accept as being social advancement, if you like. With Jack Reacher, it's a similar thing. He doesn't want his Jack Reacher to change. He wants him to be the same at the end of the book as he was at the beginning, so that he can have another book next year. Absolutely right. But what he does do, and what he acknowledges in my book, is that characters around him will change and grow. Someone has to change and grow. The protagonist of Back to the Future, Marty McFly, is the same at the end as he was at the beginning. But his dad changed and grew. Do you see what I mean? So long as somebody does, it doesn't matter who it is. And in fact, having other characters stay the same and fail to change, fail to grow, can often exemplify, can heighten the message you're giving to your audience about the character growth that did take place, wherever that might be. Those things are all there. I think if you read any Jack Reacher novel, you'll find that someone somewhere is growing, changing, developing, and exemplifying some life lesson.
And then on Lee Child again and other such bestsellers, how can we as authors engineer, I guess, a story? And maybe this is a very commercial question, but how can one engineer that type of bestseller? You know, did he design that, or is that something that just happened?
He did design that. He came out of working in television and he recognised the need for character. Everything's driven by character. He said people don't go into the shop to buy a Lee Child book, they go into the shop to buy a Jack Reacher book. You don't buy a J.K. Rowling, you buy a Harry Potter. In his view, you know, his example was the Lone Ranger. Everybody knows the Lone Ranger, everyone knows who he is, knows that he sits on a horse and goes off and does cowboy stuff. Can anybody remember a single thing that the Lone Ranger ever did? No, they can't. Yogi Bear, Top Cat, whatever it might be, they're characters. Nobody can remember what they do. And the strength, the power of a character is fundamental to selling your story. So I would suggest that the character should drive most of what you do. He's only ever had one character and that's all he ever wanted. A book a year, that productivity is there, the character is the same. So if you go into an airport, you think, what shall I buy? I've got a long trip coming back from Australia or whatever, and you think, I'm on safe ground with the Lee Child book because I know Jack Reacher, I know what he does, I know I'm going to enjoy it, and so it's going to work, isn't it? You aren't going to pick up something new that might disappoint.
Fantastic. Right, so tell us a bit about your book and where people can find it and you.
My book, the storybook. There it is. This can be found in all good bookshops, of course, depending where in the world you are. It's only published in the UK, so on ebooks, on Amazon, Amazon.com, Kindle, of course, and on my website, www.baboulene.com.
Fantastic. Well, thanks ever so much for your time, David.
My pleasure.